My name is Charlene Regester. I'm an associate professor in the Department of African, African American, and Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Today, I will be providing the introduction for Oscar Micheaux's Within Our Gates, 1920. This is his second film that he made in a career that spanned from 1918 to 1948. Micheaux was born January the 2nd of 1884 in Metropolis, Illinois, to parents who were former slaves. After attending public schools in Metropolis, he became a Pullman porter who worked on the train that ran from Chicago, Illinois to Portland, Oregon, known as the Chicago-Portland Run. With exposure gained as a Pullman porter, interacting with new ideas and people from across the country, Micheaux decided to become a landowner. And in the early 1900s, he moved to Gregory, South Dakota, becoming one of the few Black homesteaders residing in this region. Initially, he purchased 160 acres of land, and by 1911, he had acquired 320 acres of land. While living in South Dakota, Micheaux, like many others, tried to make a living as a farmer, but he found it to be incredibly difficult. Micheaux published his first novel, The Conquest, the story of a Negro pioneer, in 1913. The novel focused on many of the white farmers with whom he had encountered while living in South Dakota. He created fictional characters based on his white neighbors, and they were so fascinated with reading about themselves, they began to publish his endeavors. The Western Book Supply Company published many of his first novels. Following the publication of The Conquest, 2 years later, Micheaux published his second novel, The Forged Note, A Romance of the Darker Races, in 1915. And 1 year later, in 1917, he published his third novel, The Homesteader. Micheaux would write a total of some 7 novels over the course of his career. 4 of these novels were published in the 1940s during the latter years of his career. These later novels include The Wind from Nowhere, 1941, The Case of Mrs. Wingate, 1944, The Story of Dorothy Stanfield, 1946, and his final novel was The Masquerade, an historical novel, 1947. But with the publication of his third novel, The Homesteader, Micheaux decided that he wanted this novel to be made into a motion picture. Initially, he approached the Black filmmakers George and Noble Johnson of the Lincoln Motion Picture Company and proposed that he be allowed to direct the picture. But they believed Micheaux to be inexperienced in filmmaking and refused his offer, which led him to make his own motion picture. As a result, Micheaux would learn as much as he could about filmmaking and produce his own picture, which propelled him to change the name of his book publishing company to the Micheaux Book and Film Company in 1918. When he began to make other pictures, his company changed its name to the Micheaux Film Corporation, producers and distributors of high-class Negro feature photoplays. When Micheaux's The Homesteader was completed, it was nearly 3 hours in length. It featured the prominent Black theater actress Evelyn Prier, and it became the first ever feature-length film to be made by an African-American filmmaker. The Homesteader focuses on a Black homesteader, Jean-Baptiste, who develops an attraction to a young woman he assumes is white, but abandons this relationship in part because of the danger that interracial relationships posed in view of the miscegenation laws. He then marries a Black woman, Orlean, who is named after his first wife in real life. But when this marriage dissolves, he returns to his former love interest, whom he later discovers is Black, a discovery that allows him to engage in a legitimate romantic relationship, since he would no longer be in violation of laws that banned interracial relationships. The Homesteader film was favorably received in the Black press, as one review stated, quote, "The Homesteader is not a sensational picture or story as Western stories go, but it is the story of the West as it is, a thing that will prove educational as well as interesting. To the credit of the producers, among other things, must be given the fact that every detail of the production has been given the most minute care. The characters for their particular parts have been chosen and conform to the description in the book so fully that it is marvelous, end of quote. Although the film was well received, the film had difficulty receiving censor approval when it was reviewed for exhibition in Chicago. Film censors were reluctant to approve the film when Black ministers complained that the picture implicated a Black minister from Chicago who was depicted as hypocritical. The minister is believed to have been molded after Micheaux's own father-in-law from his first marriage to Orlean McCracken, whom he married in 1918. And although Orlean moved to South Dakota with Micheaux, the marriage was short-lived due to her imposing father-in-law, an African-American minister. As previously suggested, Micheaux even named some of the characters in the film after members of his own family, and then exhibits the film in the very city where his in-laws and former wife reside, demonstrating why some were opposed to the film's exhibition in Chicago. Although the film was viewed with some degree of skepticism from Chicago's Film Censor Board, it was eventually approved for exhibition. Following the release of Micheaux's first picture, The Homesteader, he would continue to produce nearly 45 films over the next 3 decades, which have been characterized into 2 periods of filmmaking. The first period occurred from 1918 through 1929. A period that is distinguished by favorable reviews it received in the Black press. More pictures are produced in this period. The pictures are more diverse in terms of the themes they address, such as interracial relationships, miscegenation, lynching, the existence of the Ku Klux Klan, vices that lead to the destruction of the African American community. In this first period, Micheaux produced a number of films: The Homesteader, 1919, Within Our Gates, 1920, The Brute, 1920, The Symbol of the Unconquered, 1920, The Gonzales Mystery, 1921, The Dungeon, 1922, The Virgin of Seminole, 1922, Deceit, 1923, Birthright, 1924, A Son of Satan, 1924, The House Behind the Cedars, 1924-25, The Devil's Disciple, 1925, Body and Soul, 1925, The Conjure Woman, 1926, The Spider's Web, 1926, The Millionaire, 1927, 30 Years Later, 1928, The Wages of Sin, 1929, and When Men Betray, 1929. Unfortunately, at the end of this first period of filmmaking in the late 1920s, Micheaux, who like many others, faced the Great Depression and had to file for bankruptcy. He was forced to reorganize his company and join with others in order to make the company financially solvent. With this reorganization, many believe that he lost control over his productions. And of course, this would represent the beginning of his second period of his filmmaking career. Micheaux embarked on a second period of filmmaking that occurred from 1930 to 1948, a period in which he received few favorable reviews in the Black press. His films were less diverse in terms of the kinds of issues he addressed, and he produced fewer films in this period than those made in the first period. Moreover, it was during the second phase of his filmmaking career that he married for a second time in 1926 to Alice Burton Russell, a North Carolina native and daughter of a Black newspaper editor. She invested in Micheaux's filmmaking company when the company was forced to reorganize, and she served in a number of capacities as a producer, screenwriter, director, and maybe even wardrobe consultant. But more importantly, it was Micheaux's second picture, Within Our Gates, which inaugurates him into a first-class filmmaker for its complexity of plot, sophisticated filmmaking technique through his use of parallel editing, flashbacks and dreamlike sequences, exposure of controversial topics, critiques of race relation in the 20th century America, and most of all, his bodacious reenactment of a lynching on the screen. This film virtually disappeared from the United States until the 1970s, when it was retrieved from an archive in Madrid, Spain, where it was titled La Negra, and returned to the Library of Congress. Within Our Gates was initially shown in January 1920 at the Vendome Theater in Chicago, and its timing cannot be ignored because it was released some 6 months after race riots occurred in 1919, referred to as the Red Summer. These race riots erupted when white terrorists leveled attacks against Black communities in places such as Chicago, Washington, D.C., and cities like Longport, Port Arthur, and Texarkana, Texas, among others, forcing Blacks to defend themselves. Some scholars have suggested that to release such a controversial film when racial tensions were heightened added to the film's intensity that not only invited censorship difficulties, but also might have further inflamed Black spectators intent on defending themselves against racist attacks. When the film was released, advertisements appeared in Black newspapers such as the Chicago Defender, where the film was promoted as, quote, a preachment of race prejudice and the glaring injustices practiced upon our people, end of quote. Another ad stated, a picture that will make you grit your teeth in silent indignation, end of quote. And another ad said, quote, a picture that will hold you spellbound, end of quote. Within Our Gates was unquestionably controversial. The film focuses on a Black sharecropper who's wrongly accused of killing his white boss when a white male shoots through an open window and a Black male eyewitness observing the dispute between Black employee and white boss circulates a rumor that the Black male is guilty of murder. Believing the rumor and automatically assuming that the Black male is guilty of murder, the whites join forces to lynch the Black sharecropper and his family. As the lynchings of the mother and father take place while their son manages to escape, the white sharecropper's brother decides to avenge for the death of his brother, and he proceeds to assault the Black sharecropper's adopted daughter. But in a scandalous scene, the white boss's brother chases the Black female victim, and when he subdues her, he discovers a scar on her chest and realizes that she is his daughter. With the revelation that the Black female is the daughter of the white male, this provoked controversy because while it was well known that white males fathered children with Black women, this had never been publicly displayed on screen. Given that the film exposed white paternity and challenged the hypocrisy of a white patriarchy, a patriarchy that simultaneously punished Blacks through lynching was a bold statement that Micheaux dared to make in his film Within Our Gates. Furthermore, Micheaux's Within Our Gates forced spectators to contend with the rampant lynchings that occurred throughout the U.S., and the film became an act of protestation to such abuse or disregard for Black lives. This graphic excoriation of Black bodies, which is revealed with such force and veracity, cannot be dismissed. Micheaux's Within Our Gates forces us to return to the history of lynchings that occurred in the U.S., where as many as 4,400 Blacks were lynched from 1887 to 1950, according to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice located in Montgomery, Alabama. Notably, just 6 months before Within Our Gates' release, the lynching of Chilton Jennings had occurred in Gilmer, Texas on July 4th of 1919. And some 6 months after the film's release, in July of 1920, two brothers, Irvin and Herman Arthur, were lynched, one of whom was a World War I veteran in Paris, Texas, having been accused of murdering a white landlord and his son following a dispute. Among other conceivable violations the film commits is that some scholars contend that Within Our Gates was a direct attack on the previously produced The Birth of a Nation, 1915, a film that was made some 5 years earlier and that promoted anti-Black sentiment. White filmmaker D.W. Griffith and author Thomas Dixon, who wrote The Klansman, produced The Birth of a Nation as a Civil War drama that focuses on the Reconstruction era. However, they present in their film that when Blacks gained power as elected officials during Reconstruction, they attempted to assert their power over whites and were intent on passing legislation that sanctioned interracial marriage. The anti-Black sentiment in the film appropriates, or that the film appropriates, was not disconnected from the fact that Griffith had produced one of the most technologically advanced films of its time. However, when a white female victim leaps to her death when a Black male attacker threatens to pursue her, this scene is regarded as so disturbing to white sensibilities because it implied that Black males were predators and white males no longer had power to protect white women, particularly during a period when white Southerners were deemed vulnerable as they were recovering from war. But more than this, in another scene, when a recently elected Black male lieutenant governor desires to marry a white female who is resistant to his marriage proposal, she has to be rescued by none other than the Ku Klux Klan. Therefore, many believe that The Birth of a Nation had inflicted irreparable harm to the Black screen image. And following the film's release, riots erupted in northern cities. The NAACP also launched a campaign to prohibit the film's exhibition, and leaders, both Black and white, publicly denounced the picture. Micheaux Within Our Gates, then, according to some scholars, has been regarded as a response to the racially insightful The Birth of a Nation. And although the film created resentment and discord in the African American community, this was not the only parallel between the two films. Scholar Jane Gain argues that the Micheaux film speaks to Griffith's film through his filmmaking techniques when he introduces parallel editing, a technique that Griffith perfects in his The Birth of a Nation. Micheaux utilizes Griffith's cross-cutting technique, wherein he cuts from the attempted sexual assault the white male levels against the Black female to the lynching of the young woman's family, who was surrounded by a white lynch mob. Thus, Micheaux exploits Griffith's cross-cutting technique when the camera cuts from the rape sequence to the lynching sequence, a sequence that mirrors images from Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. When Griffith cross-cuts from the Black lieutenant governor's pursuit of the white female to the rioting of the KKK. In utilizing this technique, Micheaux's film speaks to the exploitation that Blacks endured at the hands of whites, while Griffith's film speaks to the threat that Black males pose to white females, which could only be rectified through the restoration of white power and control symbolized in the writing of the KKK. Aside from Within Our Gates' attempt to rescue African Americans from the damage that Birth of a Nation inflicted, the film explores other tropes that were significant to Black life, including Black education, Blacks in the middle class and its values, Black patriotism, Black and white criminality, Black migration, Black exploitation, and Black hypocrisy as when Blacks undermine each other. Within Our Gates also broadened perspectives of whiteness in its suggestion that not all whites are necessarily anti-Black, and some may even be favorable to Blacks. So I'll address some of these tropes. Education. Of these tropes, education is rendered important in Within Our Gates through the character of Sylvia Landry, a teacher who flees the South and migrates north to raise funds for the underfunded Black schools in the South. Sylvia encounters a white philanthropist who comes to her rescue after the philanthropist accidentally hits Sylvia with her car. While residing in Boston, Sylvia sees a white child in the pathway of a fast-moving vehicle, and to protect the white child, she intervenes. Though she manages to save the white child, she is accidentally hit and has to be hospitalized. The elderly white woman, Mrs. Alina Warwick, learns of Sylvia's struggle to raise money for the Black school and awards Sylvia money, even when Mrs. Warwick's white friend discourages her from doing so. Despite being deterred from granting Sylvia money to support her fundraising efforts, Warwick gives Sylvia $50,000 as opposed to the initial $5,000 she had considered. With this gesture, Micheaux is suggesting that not all whites think alike, and neither are they all reticent when it comes to Blacks. Furthermore, Micheaux emphasizes the importance of African Americans, or education for African Americans, He sees education as a vehicle for them to elevate themselves. Another trope that certainly is explored in Within Our Gates is that the film appropriates Black middle-class values, considering that it emphasizes the value of education. Sylvia is a teacher, but she's also a respectable member of the community. And Sylvia's fiance, Dr. Vivian, a doctor, is further committed through his profession to treating members of the Black community. Both she and Vivian become icons of Black respectability. Moreover, Sylvia's acquisition of education is not just confined to her own selfish motivations, but she desires to use her education to elevate her family, as when she maintains records for her father, a sharecropper, to prevent him from being exploited. Other tropes that Within Our Gates explore include Black criminality. Prior to Sylvia's relationship with Dr. Vivian, she attracts Larry, a thief. With Larry being juxtaposed to Vivian and Conrad, another love interest, Micheaux further suggests that not all Blacks are morally upright. Larry gathers stolen goods and hides out near Sylvia's school, threatening her that he will reveal her past if she does not conspire with him or maybe even comply with his demands. His unruly behavior compels Sylvia to leave the South and head to the North, where he also returns. It is in Boston that Larry is shot in a robbery, and Alma, Sylvia's cousin, calls Vivian to treat him, even though his wounds are fatal. In this instance, Micheaux exposes Black criminality and how such behavior can distract and deter from higher pursuits and imperil the pursuit of a moral path of living. Additionally, Micheaux explores white criminality, as when Philip Griddlestone's brother Armand attacks Sylvia, and he later discovers that she is his daughter, an act that hints at incest and miscegenation. Moreover, when Philippe is killed by a white male rather than a Black male, this implicates how whites also engage in criminality. A criminality that is not only associated with Blacks, but is transferred onto whites, as in the case of the murderer of Philip Griddlestone. Micheaux implies that both Blacks as well as whites can engage in criminal behavior. Another trope that Micheaux explores is Black hypocrisy. Micheaux explores Black hypocrisy through the characterization of Old Ned, a preacher who is ambiguous, and that on one hand he placates to whites, yet on the other hand he deceives Blacks. This duality is not only reflected in his behavior, but also in his subject position as a preacher and servant to Philip Griddlestone. Ned spreads rumors implicating Jasper Landry as the murderer of Philip Griddlestone. This duality is not only reflected in his behavior, but also in his subject position as a preacher, as well as servant to Philip Griddlestone. Added to this, as the Black preacher, Ned encourages his church members to pursue heaven as opposed to obtaining an education, while he swipes money from the collection plate. So while Ned placates to whites and deceives Blacks, whites, seeing through his facade, reduce him to being a meaningless jokester. Indicative of what whites think about Ned, following Philip Griddlestone's murder, when they are eager to locate a culprit for the crime and cannot find one, they turn to Ned, who becomes a prime target. Micheaux strategically constructs such a character as Ned to alert Black spectators that some within the Black community can be deceptive, and they do not always represent the best interest of the community. And then a final trope that Micheaux introduces Within Our Gates is that of Black patriotism. The film ends with an affirmation of African-American commitment to the country through its war efforts. For example, when Vivian and Sylvia are reunited, Vivian encourages Sylvia to forget her past and to focus on the heroism of those who fought in the Spanish-American War. He emphasizes that she should be proud of her race and declares, in comparison to other groups, quote unquote, "We are not immigrants." In response to the film's ending, Cedric Robinson suggests Happy endings, bourgeois couplings are fake resolutions, an escapist fantasy, lacking even the imaginative power to will away the horrific sights and sounds emanating from a society engaged in racial conflict, end of quote. Jacqueline Stewart also contends, quote, but when Micheaux uses patriotism to try to rebury the traumas unearthed in the Southern flashback, suggesting that Blacks can and should be well-behaved patriotic citizens, his rhetoric is convincing, end of quote. To further critique why Micheaux returns to the appropriation of patriotism at the film's end, perhaps like Griffith, who inserted film footage of the Hampton Institute to provide positive Black images to restore the negative Black images he had constructed in The Birth of a Nation, Micheaux created an ending to reassure whites of Black commitment to the nation and its war efforts, to thwart whatever damage might have been inflicted in his representation of a damaged white fraternity and the crucifixion of Black bodies hanging from two posts that remind us of the cross.